Okay, wonderful. Well, hello everyone and welcome to a For the Wild Reactive webinar. I'm Ayana Young, and all of our content, including the podcast, is community supported. So please consider making a tax-deductible donation at forthewild.world/donation or /donate, excuse me. Today's webinar topic is the death throes of big oil drilling in the Arctic Refuge. And tonight we have the honor to speak of this place of sheer magnificence, a place whose vast wildness is still intact enough to nourish over 200 species of migratory birds, endangered denning mother polar bears, human communities spiritually and physically that are untethered from their origins, and the largest migrating herd of land mammals on the planet, the porcupine caribou. Such places are exceedingly rare in a world that is overpaved, over-disrespected, and over-extracted. The controversy over the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the epitome of the madness of the Anthropocene. The climate is shifting already rapidly in the Arctic, and the fact that we are even considering drilling for oil in a place so extremely remote and harsh, so vitally ecologically significant and vulnerable is absolutely symbolic. It's symbolic of the collective denial, disconnect, and addiction that edges us closer and closer to the tipping points of our earthly systems. For only an addiction so blind and tethering as the one we hold with fossil fuels could justify something so unfathomable. If these destructive boundaries being pushed by the oil and gas industry can reach the Arctic, then they can reach any of the public or wild breathing spaces we still have left. So this rhetoric of the inevitable necessity of oil must end, and the need to protect the remaining places that feed the health of the greater global ecological web within a changing climate must ring louder and truer than ever. So through this panel tonight, I hope we can build momentum to make clear to the powers that be that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the fabric of life and spirit is interwoven throughout this globe, and it is not and will never be disposable. I am honored to share this space with Faith Gemmill of the Gwich'in Nation and Marissa of Earth Justice, and it's just really wonderful to be sharing this space with both of you ladies, so thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Faith, I would love to ground this conversation in a reverence for the land and the ecological web of the Arctic. And as this is your ancestral homeland, would you mind treating us to a picture of what the refuge looks and feels like? And if you could tell us about your plant and animal kin, the lands, the waters of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Sure. My community, in our language, we call it Gwich'in, and it means steep bank by the creek. Our community, Arctic Village, is directly across the river from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We have 1.8 million acres of land that is surrounded by the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We're on the south side of the Brooks Range, this beautiful mountain range in Northeast Alaska. And on the other side of the Brooks Range is 1.5 million acres, which is called the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This area is the biological heart of the Arctic Refuge, and it's critical habitat for all the species that depend on it to bring forth life. In our language, we call it Gwich'in. It means the sacred place where life begins. And we call it this because it's sacred, because it's the nursery and birthplace of the porcupine caribou herd. Our caribou has about 180,000 animals in the herd. Every spring, they migrate to the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, where they give birth to their young. They drop about 40,000 calves there in that small area. And then they migrate back down into our territories, Gwich'in homelands, where they provide sustenance for our communities. And so not only is the Arctic Refuge coastal plain the birthplace and nursery for the porcupine caribou herd, it's also an important on-land denning area for polar bears. It's a place that over 200 migratory species of birds nest, and it's just critical habitat that's very vital to our Arctic ecosystem. And so for our people, it's a sacred place. Our homelands are very beautiful. We, the Gwich'in Nation, live a subsistence-based way of life. We hunt, we fish, and we gather to survive here in the north. And we live very close to the land. For us to live our subsistence way of life, our land has to be intact. The land has to be intact. So oil drilling being pushed within the birthplace of the caribou, it's actually a threat to our way of life. Everything we are as indigenous people is that threat. And so we have fought for over 30 years to protect this sacred place from all the major oil companies and the federal government, the state of Alaska, anyone that's tried to seek access to this place. We are united in our position to protect this place. There's over 10,000 Gwich'in people in 15 villages that live in Northeast Alaska and Northwest Canada. Most of our communities in the northern part of our nation are strategically located along the migratory route of the porcupine caribou herd. So we all stand with one voice to protect this area.
Thank you, Faith, so much. I feel transported when you speak about this place because I feel like I can hear the land in your voice, and I really appreciate hearing that and setting the stage for this conversation. And to get into some of the politics behind what you've been fighting for the past 30 years, I guess from what I understand, a backdoor approach was utilized to sneak an opening in this ANWR or ANWR to drilling into the 2018 Senate budget plan in October. And this is a provision was included that directed the Energy and Natural Resource Committee to raise $1 billion to fund tax breaks over the next decade, targeting the ANWR as the source of such revenue. And then last week, Lisa Murkowski, the Alaskan Republican chairman to Senate Energy and National Resource Committee, released legislation that called for the sale of 2 major leases within the 1002 area that lies within the coastal plain of the refuge. So Marissa and Faith, but I would love to start with you, Marissa. Could you clarify this? What is the status of proposed legislation and potential oil leases?
Sure, happy to. And thank you again for the honor of sharing the space with you and with Faith and all of your viewers. It's easy, I think, to get disconnected from these places that we love and want to protect here in Washington, D.C. And it really is an honor to be able to work with Faith and the Gwich'in Nation and with all of you, because the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is public land. It belongs to the American people as well. And so it is an honor to be able to elevate the voices of the Gwich'in and the public voice here in Washington, D.C. to our elected representatives, because the vast majority of you, of the American people, want to keep this place protected, not just temporarily, but permanently protected from any future oil and gas development. So I'll just start with a sense of gratitude. But to get to the politics of it, I'll just take a step back actually and give a little bit of the legal background about how this place was established, because that helps provide some context for what Senator Murkowski is trying to do and what the Congress is trying to do with budget reconciliation. So the Arctic National Wildlife Range was actually first set up in 1960 under President Eisenhower, and it was 8.9 million acres at that point. It was later on expanded in 1980 under the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act under President Carter. And what that act did was that act expanded it, and it actually created, I guess, like 3, you can think of it as 3 separate areas in terms of legal jurisdiction. So the whole area now is about 19.6 million acres. It's about the size of South Carolina. About 9.1 million acres of that, the southern portion of it, is it's managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under a quote-unquote minimal management designation, which means that there can be some recreational activities like camping and hiking. There can be some hunting and fishing that happens there. Then there are about 8 million acres that are declared wilderness, again, under the management of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that is a little more restricted in terms of what is allowed there in terms of development. So there can be very, very minimal development or disturbance on wilderness lands, and definitely no oil and gas development. And then there is the 1.5 million acre coastal plain that Faith talked about. And the reason why it's given this 1002, we still refer to it as the 1002 area, is because that's the part of ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. That's the part of the law that designated it. And the reason why that area is separated from the rest is because under that provision in the law, no oil and gas was allowed there, but it did allow for a one-time seismic exploration program to look at the potential, like what sort of oil and gas resources were there, but it also called for an inventory of what natural resources there, what animals were there, and to do an impact assessment on what the impacts of oil and gas development would be on those natural resources, on the indigenous people living there, and on the wildlife that depends on this area. And so, and then it also said that in order for oil and gas to happen there, it would need an act of Congress to open it up. So we get to, ever since then, there has been attempts by Congress to both permanently protect the 1002 area, the coastal plain, as wilderness, and there have been attempts to open it up. And because every single time it has been brought up as a standalone measure to open up this place for oil and gas development, it's failed. Because of that, proponents of drilling have had to use backdoor mechanisms to try and open it up, which brings us to the budget reconciliation process. Now, the budget reconciliation process is an optional measure, and it happens when Congress passes a budget resolution, and in order to meet certain revenue or deficit spending levels, they include instructions to one of the 12 House or Senate committees to either raise or cut a certain amount of revenue. And under the Senate rules, a reconciliation bill only needs a simple majority. And in 1995 and in 2005, Republicans had a majority, and they tried this tactic by including a provision in the reconciliation bill to open up the coastal plain to oil and gas development, because oil leases, when companies buy them, can be considered as a source of revenue. So that's why they can include it in the budget reconciliation process. So both of those times in 1995, the reconciliation bill passed through the House and Senate, but failed because President Clinton vetoed it. What happened in 2005 was pretty incredible, because you had a Republican Congress and a Republican president, President Bush, but it failed because there were a group of moderate Republicans who decided to strip the language at the last minute. Which brings us to today, where once again we have a Republican Congress and a Republican president, and who's in his executive budget did call for opening up the Arctic Refuge for oil and gas development as part of the budget process. Last week, we saw Senator Murkowski, which you alluded to, Anna, had her bill, because they received instructions to raise a little over $1 billion over the next decade as part of budget reconciliation in order to fund tax breaks for corporations and billionaires, as we've seen. And so where we are with that now is that tomorrow morning, actually, the bill is being marked up for consideration in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. We expect them to vote it out of committee, after which it will be coupled with other reconciliation instructions into one reconciliation bill, and then that will have to be voted on by the House and the Senate. If there are differences, then they will have to come to a conference to resolve those differences before a final budget reconciliation package is passed. So that's where we are.
Wow. Thank you so much for walking us through this very complex system that is allowing or hoping to allow this drilling to happen. Faith, is there anything that you wanted to add to Marissa's explanation of where we're at right now, and or even how it got to be there?
Just that this process, the Arctic Refuge issue should be debated fairly in public process. It should not be tucked under this bill, a must-pass bill, and it's a sacrifice of our people and our way of life. It shouldn't be done this way. That's not proper. It's not appropriate. Mm-hmm. And because they think that it's the only way to do this, that's why they're moving forward through the budget reconciliation process. It just makes it harder for people to engage in the process. And we all just got out of meetings with Gwich'in leadership where we had to explain exactly how Marissa explained to our leadership, so they would understand this process and how we can engage as Gwich'in in Washington, D.C. through the process, throughout the process. We're just calling on people to to engage where they can contact their members of Congress, their senators, and let them know that the budget reconciliation process should not contain any provisions to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Mm-hmm. And just for some of the audience that may be coming into this topic anew, would either of you mind just going over one more time what's at stake for tomorrow? Because that's what you were saying, tomorrow. Yeah, if we could just go over that and just kind of underline it so people really understand the urgency.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can take that on. So where we are right now is a budget resolution has been passed by both the House and the Senate. The Senate version contained, well, the version that was agreed on eventually by both chambers included instructions to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to raise a little over $1 billion over the next 10 years to help offset the expected 1.5 trillion deficit that is going to come from the Republican tax overhaul. And so per those instructions, there's actually a hearing on November 2nd in that committee, specifically focused on the Arctic Refuge. There was no consideration of any other way to meet those instructions than drilling in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. And on last Friday, we finally got that piece of legislation. And tomorrow there will be a markup or a vote on it in the committee where you will see a bunch of different amendments being offered by Democrats. It's unclear how successful or unsuccessful those will be, but it is expected that the proposed legislation will probably pass through committee, at which point then it will go and be part of the larger budget reconciliation bill that will need a vote from the full House and the full Senate. But Faith is absolutely right. Now is one of the most critical times. The Arctic Refuge has never been under a threat like this before legislatively. And from spending my days in and out of the Hill, in and out of offices, representatives and senators, they said they're not hearing enough from their constituents. And so we really, really need everyone to speak up, to call, to email every single day, every hour, every single day, to send, a number of different messages, but probably the most important one is that this is not a budget issue. This is not a budget issue. To think that opening up the coastal plain is going to offset any deficit from this tax overhaul is pure fallacy. This is a public lands giveaway to the oil and gas industry only because Senator Murkowski and the Republican delegation from Alaska want it. Any reasons that they give for wanting to open up this area, we have factual evidence to refute all of them. And I think the most important one, from purely a economic budget perspective, since we're talking about the budget, this is not going to raise the $1 billion that they think it's going to over the next decade. In order to do that, there's a report that came out from the Alaska Wilderness League that folks can go and look up. And the Center for American Progress did some analysis on this as well. In order to actually meet that number, every single acre of the 1.5 million acres of the coastal plain would have to be sold at a price of like $2,400 per acre. That is over 100 times what companies are bidding on for other parts of the North Slope that are already open for oil and gas development. And I think it's really, really telling that in this hearing on opening up the Arctic Refuge as part of the budget process, Senator Murkowski did not invite anyone from the oil and gas industry. And I have pages of quotes from people who are advisors, who study oil and gas economics, who say companies don't want to go to this area. It is hard and expensive to drill in the Arctic, and they're going to want to go elsewhere. It's just not worth it when the price per barrel of oil is hovering around $50. In order to make it profitable, you're looking at has to be between $70 and $100 per barrel. So it's just not a budget issue. It's not worth it. It's not going to create more jobs. It's not going to reduce the price of oil. It's going to be exported anyway because the U.S. exports most of its oil right now. And that's not even getting into the human rights issues and the ecological values that Faith talked about at the beginning.
Wow, thank you for explaining that even more in depth. And it's really interesting that it is in this budget committee when you consider the dangers and the feasibility of drilling oil in such an extreme, inaccessible climate and environment. And then you have to wonder how much oil is truly there. And depending on how much oil there is there, and then what the cost of exploration and extraction would be, and compare that to what you're actually getting out. And then the point that you're talking about with the actual cost of the leases. I mean, there are so many numbers that aren't really adding up to it being profitable. And it's so soul-sucking that we actually even have to talk about this area in terms of profits to get to a place that makes sense for those who can't understand the cultural and ecological and human rights value of this for what it is, but instead have to talk about it in a profit way. And so then my mind goes, okay, well, if we can see that it's culturally, ecologically, and destructive, and then on top of that not being profitable, my mind goes to then why? What is the power behind this? If it isn't a budget issue, why is it in the budget committee? And who is pushing this forward, and for what reasons?
Because this issue has been a hot button issue in Congress for over 30 years. This is one of the most controversial issues that's been debated in Congress as far as environment. And it's as if they just want to do it to lift the stringent environmental standards that protect this area. The Arctic Refuge has the highest environmental standards to protect it. It will take an act of Congress to open it to oil and gas development, or an act of Congress to protect it permanently. And all these battles have been fought all these years by both sides for either one, and we've never been able to move forward. So right now, they think the stars are aligned in their favor, and they're moving this through this backdoor approach through the budget process. But in one of the debates on the Arctic Refuge years ago, one of the senators was speaking, and he said it's actually not about the oil that's there. It's about setting precedent because of the protections that are already in place for the refuge. If they can access the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas development, they can open up any public lands that have stringent protections like the Arctic Refuge anywhere in the United States. Places that people love, like the Grand Canyon, places like that. And so that's actually what it's about. And the Arctic Refuge is in the northeast corner of Alaska. It is the last 5% of America's Arctic coast that's still protected from oil and gas development. It's the only piece of land that's still protected. Up here in Alaska, 95% of our coast is already open to oil and gas development. This is, so when we're talking about the Arctic Refuge, this is the last piece that the oil companies do not have access to. And Americans need to speak up about this area, because are we going to hand everything over to the oil companies?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's actually something that Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington, who's the Democratic chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee, brought up during that hearing. She's like, if we give away the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like what's left? This is the crown jewel of our refuge system. If we open this up, anything is vulnerable. Anything is vulnerable. And I think to delve a little bit more into the irony of the why do this, I think we have to talk about the reality that, and I want to be sensitive to this too, that the state of Alaska, so much of it is dependent on oil and gas development, on the development of its natural resources. I mean, every single person in Alaska gets a check at the end of the year from the royalties and revenues from mining and fossil fuel development. And right now they're having budget issues as a state. And so I'm sure the delegation feels some pressure to alleviate that by opening up more areas. But you have to think about the irony here in that they also admit, which a lot of other Republicans don't in the lower 48, that climate change is real and that it is having a very, very significant impact on people and wildlife, because it's happening twice as fast in Alaska as it is in anywhere else. You have Alaska Native communities that are facing the prospect of relocation. You have melting permafrost. You have wildfires that are raging for a lot longer than they ever did before. And you're seeing the porcupine caribou herd that we talk about, and other caribou herds not being able to access the lichen that they really like to live on because there's more rain and it freezes rather than snow, and they can't access their food. Polar bears, there's less sea ice for them to haul out on, and so they're forced to come inland, and they're also not able to get the diet that they need, and you have more polar bear human interactions, and I could go on and on and on. The reality is that climate change is very, very real and happening at a much faster pace in Alaska, and the Alaska delegation knows that. And in fact, the day before this hearing, the governor, lieutenant governor, announced that they need to come up with a climate change mitigation plan and transition to cleaner, renewable sources of energy to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And the very next day, they come to Washington, D.C. to speak at this hearing to talk about opening up the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge in order to raise revenue to do that. Maybe not thinking about the fact that when you dig up oil from a place, that means you're going to burn it, which means that contributes more greenhouse gas emissions. That is the cause of the global warming that is impacting your state. And this irony was actually brought up by Senators Franken and Sanders. And I didn't hear a good response for them because it's a ridiculous idea. It doesn't make any sense.
Red Oil, the group that I work with, resisting environmental destruction on indigenous lands, we have strongly recommended a moratorium on all new exploration for oil, gas, and coal as a first step towards the full phase out of fossil fuels here in the state of Alaska. so that we can move forward with a just transition to sustainable jobs, energy, and environment. And that's what needs to happen here in Alaska. There is no way that we're going to be able to drill ourselves out of the fiscal crisis that the state is in. And places like the Arctic Refuge should not be sacrificed in that short-term vision that lawmakers have. They think that we should drill everything, and they're not thinking sustainably about the budget in the state, but also sustainably about the health of our environment. We in Alaska Natives live closest to the land, and just like Marissa said, we are hit first and hit hardest by climate change, which is why we've recommended a moratorium on new exploration for fossil fuels, because usually it's our homelands that are targeted for unsustainable energy development projects, and we are the ones that have to sacrifice our way of life to meet those needs, and that's not right. So Alaska Natives have joined together, and we're standing, protecting our homelands, whether it's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or offshore in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea, or Bristol Bay, where they're trying to put a mine in the headwaters of world-renowned salmon habitat. Up here, Alaska Natives, we're fighting to protect our homelands from all of these encroaching development projects like the Arctic Refuge drilling proposition in the budget bill. And we stand because of the impacts of climate change. Our land is changing so fast, and we've raised that alarm at the local level, at the national level, and we've even gone to the international level, trying to raise the issue about global warming and let governments of the world know that humanity is at risk. And we all have to change how we live and how we use energy for all of our survival.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that phrase "just transition" is really important, because I'm not pretending, and a lot of environmental groups who work on this issue aren't pretending that that transition is going to happen overnight to clean, renewable sources of energy. But sacrificing our public lands and waters and the communities and wildlife that depend on them, as well as our climate, that is not the answer. And one statistic I just want to put out there is that right now in Alaska, oil and gas companies own it's more than 1,500 square miles of public lands. They've been sold to them for oil and gas development, but they're only operating on about 2% of that. And I don't say that to say that, oh, they should just go open that up immediately, because in fact, we've already sold more to oil and gas companies than we can burn to actually stay below that 2-degree, threshold before we hit very, very dangerous levels of global warming. But I just say that to point out the fact that oil and gas companies already own a lot of public land. And to think that they need more, that we need to open up even more to solve a financial issue, and like I pointed out before, opening up the coastal plain is not going to resolve that financial issue, then it just doesn't make any sense. It truly is an injustice to be going after the coastal plain.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I agree. And there's so many strong points that both of you have brought up that really kind of rattle the mind with how this is moving forward. And I think, Faith, you bringing up that we really, as a culture, need to, and I'm talking about a culture in the Western sense, look at how we are using fossil fuels and reestablish a relationship with energy is a core philosophy behind moving forward. We cannot just continue this excessive way of life with renewables either. Renewables have their own cost. And then, Marissa, as you were saying, it's also about a just transition, which isn't meaning that the oil industries will then own all the renewable energies and then there's still slave trade and oppression because they're still the ones in power. It's like really reinventing a whole way of relating with energy. And so thank you both so much for having this very expansive but also detailed understanding of the Arctic, but also this global understanding of the fossil fuel industry and climate change, because it is all really intersectional, and we can't really truly understand one without understanding the fuller context it's in. And both of you have talked about climate change and how in northern Alaska especially, people are feeling climate change. Even like Marissa, you were saying, the government up there realizes that the climate change is real. They're not denying it because they're actually seeing the shifts. And I would like to, especially for the audience who's listening, really get into what would happen ecologically, climatically, socially, if we were able to, or how do I say this? Like, if you could speak on the devastation ecologically, climatically, socially, that would be wrought by the proposed, seismic testing, the oil drilling, and the infrastructure development in the coastal plain.
Well, for the Gwich'in Nation, if there was ever drilling allowed in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain, it would devastate the porcupine caribou herd, which we depend on for not only our culture, our spirituality, the social fabric of our communities, our economic means, and our food security. That's what we would lose. We've been here thousands of years, and we've had a relationship with the porcupine caribou herd, and that herd being devastated by oil development in their birthplace and nursery would devastate the Gwich'in people. In our creation story, it's said that we are of one heart with the caribou. At the time of creation, the Gwich'in people came from the caribou. And when that happened, we made an agreement with the caribou. From that time on, the caribou would always retain a part of the Gwich'in heart. The Gwich'in would always retain a part of the caribou heart. In a spiritual sense, we are one. This is not much of a difference than how the Plains tribes had a relationship with the buffalo. And we know from history what happened when the buffalo were devastated. It devastated Plains tribes. That's the exact same thing that will happen to the Gwich'in if drilling is allowed in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Shouldn't we learn from history and actually do it right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would add, I'm sorry, interrupted.
No, you, please, Marissa.
I would add to that, you were right, it would start with seismic exploration, which involves taking very heavy trucks and running grids across the land. And in fact, that very first seismic program in the 1980s that I mentioned before, that was part of ANILCA, there are still scars that you can see on the landscape from that one-time plan. And the type of 3D seismic exploration that they would have to do now that goes far deeper and requires drilling some vertical exploration wells as well. I mean, that could be devastating for the landscape and for the wildlife, which Faith alluded to. There's a provision in the Murkowski bill that I would point out that says it would limit some surface impact to about 2,000 acres. And that's a number that's been out there for a long time, but that is also a falsehood. There's nothing in the bill that says that 2,000 acres has to be just concentrated in one area, and that is surface acres. I mean, when you're talking about oil and gas development, you're talking about a patch network of landing pads, roads, ice roads, pipelines to get over to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline where the oil would probably go. I mean, you're talking about probably thousands and thousands of square miles of infrastructure and impact. And you think that isn't going to interrupt the migratory patterns of the porcupine caribou herd or denning polar bears or migratory birds? It's going to have an impact. And I think the other place to look to is like, where is oil and gas already happening? There's a lot of oil and gas development already happening on the North Slope. And let's just, look at some of those impacts. I have some statistics here. Between 1996 and 2016 on the North Slope, and this is from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, there were over 7,800 spills unleashed, more than 30.1 million gallons of toxic substances, most commonly diesel, crude oil, and hydraulic oil, were spread on over 100 sites in the North Slope. And I mean, and then in the, unfortunately, it's so poorly named just to the west, the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, which we prefer to refer to as the Western Arctic, which contains a lot of similar ecological values to the Arctic Refuge. There is some oil and gas development happening there, and near the village of Gwich'in, and people there are experiencing some very severe respiratory and health impacts from the development that is encroaching near their community. So there are very, very significant ecological, health, climate impacts that we'd be looking at from developing this area that cannot be recovered. You can't restore that.
Wow. It is so heartbreaking to hear what could happen, but also to know that there's so many abuses that have already happened, and that we need to really stand for this place as a country, because we are citizens. The people who are listening who are citizens of the United States have a say and have power. And like you were saying earlier, Marissa, that the government is, when you go to, go to the Hill, that people, the government officials are saying, oh, we're not hearing from enough people. And that really takes me back. I'm like, okay, well, then they need to hear from more people. And so my question is, what can we do politically, but also otherwise, to ensure that this legislation does not pass, and that the leases do not get sold, and tangible operations don't start?
People need to weigh in right now and continue to weigh in through the whole budget process if the Arctic Refuge language continues to be in the budget reconciliation bill. Mm-hmm. We need to try to strip that language out of the budget if it does move forward with the language in the budget, we are calling for people to tell their congressmen, senators to strike down the budget if they have to.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, Faith's right. I would love for this to end tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
but there will be other opportunities if this bill is passed through the committee. And so every opportunity, we should make sure that you are not only like calling your representatives in the House and in the Senate, but I think there are other ways to elevate this issue too. You know, write letters to the editor, write op-eds, call your friends. You know, a personal anecdote of mine, I think I remember seeing, I was in middle school at the time, a documentary called Oil on Ice, which was about drilling in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, and it featured spokespeople from the Gwich'in Nation, and it was such a moving moment for me, just even as a young activist, that I organized a viewing in my community of this documentary and said, you know, we need to write letters and we need to organize around this issue. And I think it's amazing, but also really sad that 15, 16 years plus, I'm still trying to protect the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. But that's something very tangible that people can do. You know, spread the word in your community. If folks don't know about it, go learn, go help educate others, and then take action.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I'm already thinking about the ways in which to organize my friends and community to get behind this, because I know that there are so many issues right now that are pulling people's attention, and my own included, and I feel that the Arctic, not that it is more important, but that it is paramount, and it is so globally significant for all of us to care about and to focus our attention onto, because not only is this sacred place one of the last remaining sacred places that haven't been completely destroyed by industrialization and development, but also, like both of you were saying, that if the Arctic is allowed to be drilled, then this is kind of the cliff's edge of drilling. I mean, if we're going to open this up, then what else? We have to hold the line somewhere. We have to hold the line and say no more somewhere before it's just a free-for-all, which is what the oil and gas industry are trying to make it with opening up Bear Ears and all the other public lands right now. I mean, we have to hold these lines. And so another thought I was, coming to me as you were both talking is, I mean, are there possibilities for the refuge being designated as a wilderness, or, which would allow it to receive permanent protection? Or is there anything to rally around potentially like wilderness protection or the Endangered Species Act with polar bears? Like, are there other angles that we can work?
Yes, there absolutely are. And I think you read my mind a little. Like I said, there have been attempts since the 80s to try and permanently protect this area. And we fortunately do have some great congressional champions who are still trying to do that. And they're working to get co-sponsors on their bills. So while you are on the phone or writing emails or even going to the district offices of your representatives in person, not only should you ask that that drilling in the Arctic Refuge not be part of the budget, you can ask for its permanent protection. And the numbers on those bills, if you really want it, in the Senate, it's SH20. That's been introduced by Senators Markey and Bennett. And then on the House side, it's actually a bipartisan bill, which is fantastic. It's HR 1889, and that's been introduced by Representatives Huffman, Fitzpatrick, Gallego, and Lobiondo. So ask them to support those. Sign on.
Yeah. And so those bills would put a wilderness protection around the Arctic, and that is a permanent protection, and that protects against drilling completely.
Yes.
Ooh, that's exciting. Well, I think that it's really important that we can fight against and simultaneously put into place what we want. To be able to go at it from both sides is, I think, an even stronger strategy. And so I thank you both so much for explaining these two different pieces that we can be speaking to our representatives about and making media about and talking about, and putting our energy into. So gosh, thank you both so much for taking us into this space and explaining the spiritual and intellectual, political, legal components of this issue that we're facing. And I would just love to open up the floor to both of you to speak to, however you see fit at this point, from if you want to expand on some things you've touched on, or whatever you think is most pertinent for us to take away from this time together.
Sure. I'll start. For us here in Alaska, Alaska Natives, we are calling on humanity to basically wake up. It's time for humanity to wake up. That the earth cannot sustain further destruction from our use or misuse of energy. And that's what this issue is about. In 1988, when the Gwich'in Nation first came together to raise our voices collectively to protect the Arctic Refuge, that was what our elders said. They said, go out there, tell them how we live, who we are, and do it in a good way, and we're going to be successful. The other part is they said, tell them that we're not just protecting that area for ourselves. We're protecting the Arctic Refuge for all humanity. Because in our prophecies and our beliefs, if that area is ever encroached on by human beings, we believe that it will put forward the beginning of the end for humanity, because it's such a sacred place and we have a prophecy about it. The prophecy states that the North is going to win. So we believe and have hope that humankind will do the right thing, and we actually will change our relationship to the earth and start moving towards sustainability. And that's exactly what needs to be done for all of us to survive. This issue is about our grandchildren and their children. And that's the bottom line for us up here in Alaska. And it's in line with what just came out today. I was just reading this, that 15,000 scientists from 184 countries have issued a warning to humanity. And they're calling on humankind to curtail environmental destruction. And they're cautioning that a great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided. So scientists are saying the same thing that indigenous people are saying right now, and that we all need to wake up and start changing how we live on this earth, because we only have one environment. Once it's destroyed, you can't turn back time.
Thank you for that. One thing that I wanted to expand on a little bit more than I did before was to go into the values and the reasons for creating this place, like legally, in the first place. I mean, these are values that the Gwich'in, people like Faith, like have understood for generations, but this is the way we in the West put it down in laws. When it was first created in 1960, it was created because of its unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreation values. In the 1980, when it was expanded, it was created for 4 purposes: to conserve animals and plants for natural diversity, ensure a place for hunting and gathering, protect water quality and quantity, and fulfill international wildlife treaty obligations. Nowhere in there does it say anything about oil development. Those are the purposes and the values that we need to protect. And I think when we look back on this point, I want to be able to tell the story. There was a really interesting quote in an op-ed that said, "The history of America is the chronicle of a grasping people. Like, we always take and we want more. And will we have the generosity of an imagination to gently handle a place mostly untouched and pristine? And can we restrain ourselves?" And so I hope that when we look back on this choice between destruction and stewardship, between short-term profit and long-term resiliency, that I can tell the story to future generations that we made the right choice.
I have so enjoyed and felt honored to speak with you both. You're both such incredible leaders in this time, and are able to so eloquently express very complex issues of the mind and spirit, and as well as the governmental, legislative, legal pieces of this. So I just want to both thank you so much for your work, your dedication to this earth and for all of us. And I just want to continue supporting both of you on this path, and for all of you out there in the audience. We heard so much of the tangible steps that we can take, and I think that when we are dealing with the catastrophe of the Anthropocene and climate change and social injustices left and right, I think a lot of us feel a weight of, well, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Well, we were just explained extremely clearly tonight things we can actually do about this. And this is a social justice issue. This is a climate change issue. This is an environmental issue. This is a global issue. And we have steps that all of us can take and feel fulfilled by doing that. We can feel like we are actually doing our part, and not feel so debilitated and powerless, because we just need to keep taking the tangible steps, and the more of us that get on board, the bigger changes we'll see. So I'm really excited and feeling very fired up to join my community to do our part in this, and I want to invite everybody to do that. So on For the Wild, we'll start organizing some things on our side to help rally some folks. And yeah, thank you both so much. And I hope to check in with you both again once the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge has become protected wilderness forever, and we can celebrate and just, I'm sure, hear the caribou and all of the creatures up there breathe a sigh of relief that their human counterparts stood up for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an honor.
Yeah. Well, bye for now, ladies.
Good night.
Bye.